Alright, appears to be another draft physics video production and such. Some not very useful comments. It's hard to know what to make of the comments, actually. The absence of any that are rational or reasonable or at all interesting. I take it as a bit of success that people can't obviously make any kind of simple debunk of what I'm saying. But yes, very little to challenge me. Ken Willers has smooth brain logic just as much as his head. It's not a very smooth sentence, actually, so I think I'll delete it just for that. It's just kind of useless. Clearly, Ken Wheeler believes a lot of things, and one has to question why he believes those things. And I'd say also clearly he's not really making an honest argument. He knows things that he's not saying, like with the ferrocell. Anyway, Miles Mathis is right. Another just too stupid a comment. I mean, just too useless. Clearly he's wrong about all kinds of bizarre conspiracies he believes in. Stephen Hawking wasn't a fake body double for 15 years. If you believe he was, you're really, you're fucked up. I mean, get help. Pi equals 4. I demonstrated how he didn't even have the right mathematical equation, but clearly to not understand the difference between something orbiting in gravity and somebody running around a track in a circle, it's a big error. You're an idiot. Disabler. Is this what's really going on, or just a model that seems to work? Just a model that seemed to work. Well, that's really all we can do is model, and making it work, that is fitting all the evidence, is not that easy. That's why Einstein spent his whole life being pretty depressed and not too satisfied with his accomplishment, because he couldn't make it all make sense. He couldn't fix what seemed obvious incongruities, disconnects, things that just can't make bent space do magnetism, can't make quantum mechanics do gravity, that kind of thing. So it just doesn't work, their model, very well. And mine does. Yes, I believe 80% of what I'm saying is going to be proven to be, yes, that's the way it does actually work. Yes. I think so. But that's all you can, So whatever. Stupid question. So I'll delete it. So anyway, whiteboard we have. So we'll try some different ways of doing this. I figured before that I would preface it with some argument about Bill Gaede and Fractal Woman. So apparently she felt threatened by his aggressive attitude of dismissing her science as rubbish. And on the internet you do get the trolls and the silly comments people could make, threatening emails. I don't know how big the threat was actually, but regardless, she decided to private her videos and is apprehensive about continuing to speak her mind, so to speak. And Bill Gates is right in the sense that, well, this is the environment, and if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen, kind of thing. It's a funny thing to say to a woman, but I mean, it's sorry, but that's the way it is on the internet. And although I think he was gratuitously male, in dismissing, playing the female card. It's a real card. Women are new to this freedom thing, I suppose, and they haven't quite got it right. They seem to want to imitate all the negative things of men, like they want to fart and stuff and belch and act like assholes. But they don't seem to want to really play, in a strict sense. They still want to paint flowers around everything, and pretend things are whatever, fairy tale-ish. They're still telling little, kid stories. But anyway, it's still mixed in there. It's still in the pattern. And that's a profile. It's not anything personal. I think Fractal Woman did a good job of being serious about what she was doing. I just think it's kind of obvious that what she's doing is tainted by woman perspective. But anyway, now I'm being kind of chauvinist. So anyway, it's just not a good circumstance. So anyway, Bill Gates, again, I like that he speaks his mind and says things that need to be said, but he says some things that really don't need to be said and are just plain stupid. And he makes arguments that are really dumb. He attempts to dismiss ideas, just with just casual, broad brush, idiotic statements that he can't defend if he had to. That is, if he was willing to be challenged directly, because they're just stupid. I mean, you can do a lot of things with different models. They can meet the evidence burden. And certainly his own theory is hardly the simplest, or it hardly deals with some of the tough questions, like how far does space go and what is space? Nothing. I mean, it was making an argument kind of like, well, what's around these particles? Space? And what's space? And, well, what's around your ropes? I mean, what separates one rope from another rope? There's nothing there, right? It just doesn't make any sense as an argument. It's just really poor. So, anyway, that's part of the story. So, I will pause and enlarge this, and we'll see if this works at all. We'll see. I'll do the preliminary drawing. So we'll just go through a couple of things. I mean, something I did observe that was sort of interesting. And we'll see if drawing attempts or in some way helps to illustrate the point. Something like that. Alright, should be back. Attempted a change in the resolution of the camera, and we have stuff. Alright, so I'm basically pointing out that electrons and protons are kind of composite particles in the sense that they gain their substance from the energy they have in them, trapped, and it's, let's say, permanently trapped. Through some compression process, little bits of force have been tied to each other and can't escape. And for the purpose of illustration, this is just going to be just showing in one dimension how something might happen, but you have to understand it's happening in all directions all the time. The force comes from all directions all the time, constantly, in an open field. And it's only when things start getting crowded that the field starts getting different than that. So the idea is that energy is absorbed by the matter bits, and their Newtonian rules apply. You have to take something, you have to give something back, that basic rule. So in this, there's two examples here. So you can see I've just represented two circumstances. It's going to be the even circumstance and then the odd circumstance. Okay, so an even number of quanta in the native state or condition of an electron, let's say. So if there was, let's say these two marks could represent 1,000,000, they could represent 1,000, somewhere in any kind of range. So an electron has a certain amount of energy in it, and it has it in all directions. And so if there is an even balance, that is, there's 4 seats in the boat going one way, and or this way and this way and this way and this way and this way, you could understand that the electron wouldn't go anywhere, because it would cancel out. There's as much mass, motion, inertia, momentum in this direction as there is in this direction, so it doesn't move. Now, if there's an odd number, it gets kind of interesting, because then it always has a bias in a direction. It either has too many going one way or too many going the other way. It's always 3 to 2, or some worse but it can never be, because it's not an even number, it can never be even. It can never be an equal number going both ways. And that would sort of explain Brownian motion, vacuum energy, the fact that even when we take as much energy as we can out of a system, there still seems to be some will to move, and that is in the native bias of an electron, I could argue, or a proton. So in this example, we'll have a piece of energy going in, and over here I'll attempt to draw the consequence of that. Now, I'm only using red and blue in here not to represent two kinds of force, just direction, just to make the direction more obvious. So I'm sorry if that confuses some, because as I've talked about, there's two kinds of force, electron force and proton force. I'm not representing that in this illustration. So a force bit would hit, and this is happening all the time, zillions of times a second. There's energy doing this exchange, and so the consequence of it going in is going to be that a force bit will come out. It'll be a reflection. So this energy is going to produce this back, and that means there's one less of these little red fellows going to be in here, because one of them will be set free. So you can almost think of it as a membrane, and the membrane just contains a certain number. And what I've done is, by moving the membrane over one, I've freed this one, and now I can capture this other one. So we can see that because this piece of momentum is going to be kept in here, that now I have that little extra, plus the two that were already in the boat that didn't get set free. So now the proportion is 3 to 1. And I think that can work. I think that can explain what we see. But I think this is probably the right answer, this odd number, because what it does seems to be even more consistent with what the evidence indicates. So the energy goes in, so it can be understood that we're going to end up with 3 blues in here. So we can put those in first, because that's going to be kept, and we're going to get the red back. The red will be freed. Gee, they're brand new. Thanks. Whatever store I bought them at. Yeah, okay. So we're going to get the same thing back. So in that sense, it answers the question, in the sense it produces the correct Newtonian equal but opposite reaction, energy in, energy out, blah blah. And the difference now is that this proportion has changed. So now there's going to be just 2 going left. Yes, it's left for you too. Okay, so you could see that the electron, every time it gains momentum, it's always a bias. So it'll never be stationary. It'll always have a bias in a direction, some kind of momentum. And if it's in a force that constantly bombards it, it will just keep switching between wanting to go this way and wanting to go that way. So in its reality, it'll just kind of oscillate in a neutral field. It just won't go anywhere. It'll just stay in a place and vibrate, and it's going to vibrate in all directions. And I think that explains a lot of the observed experimental evidence. All right. So that might be enough for that segment. So we'll pause and set up some other one. I'll do it this way. Right clicks don't work sometimes for no good reason. Alright, this segment will try to deal with just the obvious or simple gravitational argument about how an external force can be understood. Again, details are always more important than, or are important. So in the reality, there's a bunch of points in space, and each one of these points can, at any time, create a vector, a line, a ray. And they'll be coming off in all kinds of directions. Each one, at any one moment, will be producing a line. And in theory, if those lines are projected over time, they end up being, I don't know what the word for that would be, but there'll be a nice, clean, every angle will be at some point used as a place where there's a vector. So this would be solid because every single point in space would at some random time be the ray direction. So this is what kind of defeats ether theories, because ether theories would require a kind of geometry where everything would have to be, the particles would have to have an arrangement, and or the bits of pressure, or whatever you want to call them, and they'll only allow certain vectors. Like on a checkerboard, there's only certain directions you could take that will allow there to be a ray, where a free particle theory allows any vector to be used. And that's sort of what we see. We don't see any underlying geometry that restricts angles or any of that stuff. So the idea would be is that there are forces coming at any body from all directions. So I'm just using for this illustration what would be relevant to something here. And the other thing that needs to be understood is that the only thing relevant is this dimension, the two sides of that dimension. Right, these markers aren't exactly what they should be. And all the other dimensions would be irrelevant to this one-dimensional example that I'm giving you, but it's happening in all three dimensions. Obviously, you only have a front and a back. I can't get hit by light in the back when the light's coming towards me. That kind of simple argument. So all the vectors that would be produced that line up with both of these objects, all right, would be all the vectors that you could sort of understand that the mechanism of absorption would happen. The energy would go in. There would be a reflexive, energy back out that would be irrelevant to either one of these bodies. But this one would have motion in this direction after it gets, when this energy comes in. That motion in this direction would be an absorption. It means this other body doesn't get hit by any of these vectors. So anything that goes from anything in here attempting to go this way through that object is not going to get to this object, and that clearly is creating a very low pressure here in the sense that there's a bunch of missing energy, but there's still a bunch of energy hitting it from this other side. And that's the obvious pressure inequity. Now the thing to understand is, as I've pointed out previously, is that anything that has an element of direction in this direction gets counted as momentum in this direction. So this direction, right, has an element this way and an element this way. Okay, so you just ignore this and just all you're counting is the element, the part of the momentum in this direction. And that is something that's not going to be reciprocal. Energy is going to be absorbed. This is going to move, and the movement is going to do the same thing to this body, and that's the interaction. That is gravity on understanding it on one level. You really do have to understand that the gravity this thing's going to be creating is going to affect something out here or something over here, because the gravity this is falling into is gravity already created by the pressure inside of these objects. So as an object, as a thing in space gets bigger and bigger, the pressure inside gets greater and greater, because all of these surfaces are still accelerating. They're still moving. You can't stop them, essentially. And so the presence of their pressure and the fact that the pressure is being maintained, that is, you're keeping it, means that there's always this process of something missing here that doesn't get from here to there when it's supposed to. It's time. Eventually the energy will be released in some other direction, as I argue, but for the time that the thing is moving, it's been absorbed, and there's a whole pile of time where this isn't going to experience force because of that pressure. Well, I think that's the basic argument, and so we'll move on to the next bit of stuff. Wrong button. That one might work. Yeah, it should be back. So I thought I'd go over the basic diagram of how these two forces and these two elemental particles function. It doesn't really matter how we label these things as long as we understand the distinction between a proton and an electron, and the fact that they react to a force in opposite ways. So they do that absorption thing for different colors in different ways. And so if a red force comes in, an electron force, the electron will effectively keep the piece of momentum. So the electron itself, I'll put a dot here, will acquire the momentum. So it's the electron is going to move, and it will eject a bit of quanta of energy in the opposite direction. And so you could sort of understand that if I place another electron here, that this energy would constantly reflect back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, because what goes in comes right back out as a reflection, and it gives it momentum. And that's essentially the repulsion between electrons. That's why they repel each other. Now if I was to place a proton, piece of proton quanta, a bit of energy that's reflective to protons into an electron, instead of reflecting it back, it's going to just convert it, and it will leave in a perpendicular dimension. That means it could leave that way, or it could leave this way, or it could leave this way, or it could leave into the, also in. So it can come out in any of the other two dimensions, in any direction in the other two dimensions. And there seems to be, consistent with the right hand rule, a right hand preference or likelihood. So it's more likely to go that way or into the board in this example than out or left, something like that. And that would explain the right hand rule. So understanding that this is what you get, I don't know if these arrows will just make a mess. So when the opposite force hits, it goes in an opposite direction, is the point. I mean, it goes in a perpendicular. And so it doesn't do the same momentum thing. It doesn't do what the same force would do. So you can sort of understand that between electron and proton, no matter what force I might put between them, I can't trap it. Because if it's a proton force, it's going to leave the electron perpendicular. And if it's an electron force, bit of energy, it's going to leave the proton perpendicularly. Well, same color. And therefore, you can't trap anything. So the proton and the electron would be attractive to each other. Now, a circumstance that comes up eventually, you can get the idea that they're moved towards each other. But is there some point where they stop moving towards each other? What has to be understood again is that there's energy coming in from all directions all the time, of both force, both types. And what's going to happen inevitably is that, some electron force will come in from this direction, perpendicular to the proton, and it will be shot up towards the electron, and it will reflect off the electron, and therefore creates a little more pressure. So there can never be zero pressure. There's always going to be some pressure between the electron and the proton. So they can only get a certain distance apart from each other. And I would argue that that explains what physics calls the neutron, that the neutron is really just an electron and a proton that are very close to each other. They're not stuck to each other, but they're close because there's always external pressure coming in that keeps creating these reflections. So a blue force will hit the electron at the from the perpendicular direction, and that'll end up pushing the electron in this direction, and the red force will end up pushing the electron in this direction. So there's always some source of pressure between them, and they'll never touch each other. But that's effectively the neutron. And so the neutron is not, doesn't have no charge. What it has is it's a perfect dipole. It's the first magnetic dipole in the sense that it has this plus and minus component in equal quantity, and so we measure it as having no charge, especially if it's spinning. We wouldn't be able to notice the charge, but it clearly has both. It's a dipole, and it serves many functions. You can almost imagine how if I have a neutron here and I do add another component, another electron, into this equation down here, let's say. Now my logo's in the way. Anyway, okay, so there's another electron. You can see that these two electrons would be repulsive to each other, but because of the proton in the middle, none of the energy that would be reflective between the two electrons will ever hit the two electrons. It will always be diverted, and so there would be nothing here, little repulsive energy and little repulsive energy, so they both be attractive, and that could create, having a neutron and an extra electron can create a circumstance where you could have an atom, a nucleus, formed that would duplicate the neutron in one respect, in the sense that the electron and the proton could be very close. These two electrons could be closer than they usually can be. If they were in free space, you could argue that there would be too much pressure between them at this distance. The common atom might have a distance of, like this distance between the, as being even a high pressure, a very a strong orbital distance, and these electrons can end up being much closer, and it's not because there's greater pressure or greater energy, it's actually less. And so it's kind of like when they talk about the strong force in physics is really the absence of force that allows things to get very close. Because if I just change the circumstance, create one electron and two protons, you can see that the same thing would happen. The protons would be able to get much closer to each other if they have a neutron in the middle. And in a sense, this would be a proton, and this collectively would be a neutron. So you can understand how the neutron is critical to holding protons close together. And that's one of the features of atoms that is still perplexes physics, is how do you get these protons in the nucleus so close together? Well, that's what the neutrons are doing, and the neutrons are doing it by using an electron. So there are electrons, I would argue, in the nucleuses of atoms. They're just part of what we call a neutron. Alright, so probably enough on that. Probably. Keep hitting the wrong thing. I'll get the hang of it eventually. I wish that, I can't get the camera to do the widescreen thing, and I can't extend the frame any bigger for some dumb reason. Linux isn't letting me oversize the window. So anyway, the little technical details, have to work them out or not. See how it goes. I think I'm back. Yeah, I'm back. So anyway, let me just go over some of what happens, the dynamic that might happen in an atom or something. So you can imagine, let's say there's a proton here, and these are the electrons orbiting, nucleus here anyway. So the idea is that there's energy reflecting back and forth between the electrons. And there's a couple of different things you could do that could change this energy equation. Now, say if I hit, let's try a different color just for clarity. Hey, that worked good. Yeah. Hey, it's this flip screen. Okay, so say I did something, I hit an electron, and like with an electron force, so it reflects and creates a little bit of momentum in this electron. So this electron is moved. The idea would be is that it can't move very far, because then this pressure starts to increase, right? So to come in towards the proton, this electron has to get closer to these other electrons. So to go in means you go into more pressure. And that's sort of what locks the atom in place, that keeps things from moving, essentially. Is that there's pressure regulated between all the electrons. Now, you can sort of understand that if two electrons were facing each other and there's energy coming from all directions, you could understand that a piece of electron reflective energy could come in at some kind of angle and end up, because of the way the electron was moving, say it just jittered a little this way. So the electron went this way, and then the electron moved just a little bit this way, and now this piece of energy is now trapped between the two electrons. So the field can constantly feed this. Now if you can shoot and more energy coming in, extra energy from the field at those angles, obviously you could pressurize these interactions. But whatever pressure is here has to be compensated here. So no matter how much pressure you create here, you're going to equalize the pressure here, in the sense that the distance will have to change. So electrons that have, say if there's more energy in this length, then there'll be more distance in this one to reflect no, not more distance, less distance, the higher pressure. And so the higher pressure will migrate just because of the movement being created, the pressure throughout the atom, and essentially keep these proportional. I would suspect. Well, the important point is that you can see that any movement of the electron kind of changes the field that it's in and what pressure it feels. And in most cases, it can't go somewhere without an equal but opposite reaction happening where it ends up moving into more pressure. Now that especially happens when you take these collections, of electrons and protons, and you have two atoms interact with each other. What's really going to interact are these electrons. They're going to end up compressing force between them as they get closer together. So the electrons in this atom are going to essentially, there's force that's reflecting always, and you're going to make the reflections quicker. And quicker reflections mean more hits, and each hit equals momentum. So you can sort of add it up that atoms never really hit each other. They bounce off the repulsive energy of the electrons, essentially. So they create a bunch of compressive force between the electrons. That compression gets more and more intense as they get closer together, and they essentially bounce off of the pressure. Unless they have a circumstance where they're missing an electron, and then there's not as much pressure, and then they get into the situation where they can lock into each other because one of these electrons will essentially create an interaction with this other proton and this proton, and they'll share the electron, but they'll literally share it. It won't be going here and then going around here. No, it'll stay right there. A shared electron is literally shared. The position is shared by both atoms. The whole thing could turn on that shared electron. It can move on that electron, but that electron won't be going anywhere. And this even stronger bond would be to have two electrons that are shared by the two atoms. Kind of obviously. The two protons would be sharing the electron technically. Alright, that's enough for that one. I think so. Alright, so finishing up, I figure I'll play a little of this Bill Gaede's video. Really a poor video. It says all kinds of wacky stuff. It's all for the fun. Like anybody who has a particle theory should be executed. Blah, 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 blah. Again, these are kind of empty arguments, and people, they really need to deal with each other's real argument. The electric universe is guilty of strawmanning physics. Ken Wheeler's terrible when it comes to that. He just says things like, physics has never defined a field, or some other kind of horse shit. And it's really not the argument. They've defined it, but they've defined it in all kinds of ways. It's really the problem. All kinds of different ways. So we'll play some of this. Crap. It was crap.
Don't do it. Stick around and you might learn something.
So he says, if you have something better to do, don't do it. Stick around. No, well, if I thought it was a better thing to do, why would I do that? It's a pretty stupid statement. I imagine people are watching your video because they don't have something better to do, but okay.
Very big rhetorical question. And I thought I'd address it for once because, I a lot of people, over the last few years, they said, Bill, why aren't you nice?
Yes. Well, I frankly, I don't see any need to be nice, but I think some of your insults are useless, and certainly as much as I like some of it, watching Einstein spin around or something. I mean, some of the stuff is funny. Ken Wheeler in the Buddha suit is funny, but it's not a very intelligent argument. It's kind of cheating the argument. I mean, it's doing the buffooning thing. It's putting it to music or something. It's just a distraction from what the real process is. I mean, this should be taken sort of seriously, these arguments. And, that kind of trivial stuff doesn't make for a very intelligent conversation. Because everybody can do it to you too, Bill. Tie you up in ropes and stuff. Piss up a rope.
Mathematicians, they created a hereditary system.
All right, so now he's complaining about the system and the whole peer review thing, and it's all the mathematicians are defining physics, and I would agree that's really stupid. No need for where's my remote? This stupid screen wants to switch off, so I guess I have to do something. So I'll press a button here. I have it upside down. All right, sorry. I could have done something to spare you. There, I'll mute it. And then I'll unmute it. Well, that's kind of a dangerous thing to do. That should have stopped whatever it was doing. Anyway, moving on. Yes, conventional physics is a closed-minded, and clearly they have a book, a Bible. They're like Christians. The Bible has entanglement and certain things in it, and if you don't believe those things, you can't play.
They teach the next generation of mathematicians at places like Cambridge and...
Yeah, MIT is probably more relevant, but yes, in Stanford.
You'll find out, whether they are allowed to present their theory. They'll figure it out by themselves.
So, yeah, this is so he was talking about his own rational, whatever it is, society, and it's not very rational. So in a few videos back, he said, come on down and present your theory, but apparently he doesn't mean that. Because he also says, well, you'll find out that, we're not going to listen to you. So what's the point? You're just behaving badly, Bill. And it's, yes, because they behave badly, you can behave badly. Well, okay, fine, whatever. The point is that we all have to defend what we're arguing. Conventional physics has wimped out of that defense. They've pretended all dissidents are UFO flat earthers. And that's just bullshit. You're doing the same thing, Bill. Nobody who doesn't... if I can't imagine it, it can't be. I don't think so, Bill. If I didn't think of it, it can't exist. I don't think so, Bill.
Electric shocks. They might really, decide to withdraw their submission.
So again, this is, I recant, there are no such thing as particles. Electric shock therapy was successful. So again, he's making some distinction between his object called the rope and the object called the particle. Clearly particles can impose momentum, and that's all that we're really talking about is why does something move. And so you could understand that if the universe is really made out of particles doing yin and yang, and you somehow block the yang, then all there is yin. So that's not too complicated to understand how it could work to create two opposite effects, either moving towards or moving away. Now your rope theory, again, it's every atom or every electron is connected to every other electron in the universe. It's an insane number of ropes. The ropes would take up more mass than the particles themselves. And again, you're sort of conceding the existence of the particle because the particle is where the end of the rope is. So why are you so hostile to particles when you sort of need them to be the place where all the ropes connect? Yeah, whatever. Doesn't make much sense to be this excessive. So then he holds up magnets and starts talking about the de Hilsters and totally not representing their theory accurately at all. So he's not getting it. He didn't pay enough attention to get even the simplest part of it, the Lesage part of it. And the fact that he can't even deal with that as a premise. Deal with mock gravity and explain how mock gravity fails. And try to use a reason that isn't the conventional reason. Something of your own.
Okay? I use the holders because it's easier to handle these things. There you have it. Now, how difficult can this be?
It's a difficult question because there's repulsion. You turn the magnet the opposite way and it repels just as strongly. So that's what makes it a little bit tricky. But yes, it all comes down to something very simple. The magnet's really just filtering energy. Now, Bill Gaede thinks the energy is in the magnet. It perpetually is jump roping ropes. It's flinging ropes through space constantly. Doesn't explain how the rope got there. Doesn't explain how the rope moves. Where the energy comes, where the impetus comes from. What's its motivation? you know, was it always moving? Where did the movement come from, Bill? He doesn't explain any of that. So he pretends his explanation is clear when no, it doesn't clear up much at all. It certainly doesn't explain anything. This idea that ropes going this way with each other somehow is attraction and ropes going against each other is repulsion. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't, or vice versa. It doesn't explain. What do you mean? If I do that in real life, that's not what's going to happen. I'm not going to get a strong repulsive or a strong attractive force. I'm going to get a very weak force. And magnetism is a very strong force. So his explanation sucks. And so glass house, Bill, you shouldn't be degrading everybody else when your own theory doesn't hold up to very rough lighting. As soon as I put a little bit of light on it, the paper starts to burn.
So, with the golden rule, saying you need an object to do physics. That's
this whole obsession with objects and versus objects moving. I mean, clearly you can define movement and its substance, like you're moving ropes in the jump rope example. You don't negate the existence of this rope because it's moving. You don't say it's no longer an object. Clearly it's an object moving. So again, this is his hypocrisy. His objects can move, other people's objects can't move. And I would further argue that obviously there could be something that's moving perpetually, that it started by moving. Explosion, movement never stops. That's not inconceivable.
the first issue. The second one is, has anyone defined what an object is for the purposes of physics? And you won't see that either.
Yes, well, I think for the purpose of physics, an object can be something that's vibrating. It can be something that has properties, and those properties can have something to do with a movement it can't escape. Now, you could explain the more intricate function and why it moves, but there's some things you might just say it moves. That's what it does.
Simply will not see a definition of the word object, the word thing. Magnets. And no, look, here you'll see it. This is done in outer space. This is an astronaut holding magnets in outer space.
Yeah, so his assumption is that we see all forces, and therefore because we don't see a force, the force can't exist. So somehow, obviously they're not in a vacuum because he's breathing air. So all he's in is this weightlessness in an absence of gravity. So clearly the gravitational bias isn't compelling because they have the right velocity. They're falling, free falling. They're not out of gravity, they're just moving with the gravity, so the gravity has no effect on relative things in the same falling attitude. Gravity is satisfied. Doesn't mean gravity still isn't there, as I just said, and that gravity, or the force, the pressure of the universe, is still there. Magnets are still working. So again, this is a very moot point in my opinion. And if we made a pure vacuum, we took away all these other atoms and all this other stuff, it wouldn't have anything to do with the force anyway. The forces are stuff moving the speed of light. Forces aren't stuff doing what we're doing.
Out of space, and you can see that they're floating, and they do attract each other even in space. And if he does it outside the craft, it's going to be the same thing. Okay, in other words, magnets work in outer space.
Yeah, well, who thought they didn't? Who would have the expectation that they didn't anyway? So again, it's kind of a straw man argument that somebody's arguing that magnets don't work in space when I don't think anyone's arguing that. So kind of nothing argument.
The electric universe does not have a definition of their favorite word. Okay, they're called the electric universe. And Mr. Thornhill.
Right. Well, they don't explain where the carrier is for the electricity. Electricity needs a conductor. If one doesn't exist, one can be created. Plasma Plasma is you burn something, emit a bunch of atoms, and then you move the electricity through the atoms you just ejected. The atmosphere is a conductor, not a very good one. You need 1,000,000 volts to get stuff to really start to move through it. But stuff always does move through it. There is some connection between my nose and ground, and the potential will leak through the atmosphere in the form of what the hell are they called? Discharge, something discharge. The blue stuff. St. Elmo's fire kind of thing. Anyway, can't remember it. Doesn't really matter. Well, it sort of matters. It all matters.
The only issue they have to answer is what keeps the electron beam tied to the nucleus. What are they going to put in between? More particles?
Right, so again, he keeps arguing as if we have to pull something or do something from in between, when, again, the argument is no, the pressure's already on the outside, and we already see that in the form of cosmic background radiation. So, Bill, why don't you explain what cosmic background radiation is, and how you know there can't be any other radiation coming from the same place or from the same locations that is in a form that we can't detect with a radio receiver. So, what about photons that are too little energy, that is, too little quanta? We need a certain amount to be able to see photons with our eyes. Then our instruments can do a little better. They can see photons we can't see. But maybe there's a point where you can't see the photon even with instruments, because they have to move an electron a certain amount, and there's not enough energy to move it at that certain amount, so we don't see them. And what if that's gravity, Bill? So again, this argument that we have to do particle physics your way, or this really, really stupid argument that somehow regular conventional physics is particle physics. Just because they call it particle physics, Bill, you're not an ignorant man. You know they don't believe in particles. You know they turn all of those things into waves of some kind or another. So why are you saying it's particle physics when you know they don't think they're particles?
Around it, now you have to identify. You say, well, what is that black stuff?
So again, this is the idiotic part, especially pointing it to D. Hilster and saying, what's the black stuff? The black stuff is easy. It's nothing. That's what the black stuff is. It's nothing. Just like in your universe, where your rope is here and there's something next to it, which is absolutely nothing next to the rope. The ropes aren't stuck to each other. It's not all rope in your model, is it? I've seen you draw the ropes. I mean, there's space between the ropes. I assume that's not rope, and therefore nothing. So what's so complicated? You have somethings and you have nothings. You have objects and you have the space that surrounds them. How is everybody else verboten from saying something that simple? I mean, this was just stupid.
Mathematical establishment is proposing is garbage. Absolute nonsense. Total poppy.
All right, so he says the Chapel Society instead of John Chappell, because he thinks of it as a religion or something like that. And fine, I don't know if I buy that argument. I don't know if I buy that. But anyway, so this John Chappell guy was some sort of etherist, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I don't see the whole point of naming something after a guy who nobody knows who he is. The society doesn't seem to give a shit who he is. He doesn't seem relevant in any way. They're not promoting anything he exactly said. So what the fuck is it? Why is the society named after him? Did he leave you money or something? I mean, I don't know. What's the story?
The other day I mentioned some of the questions that these people would have to answer. Maybe I should put this up here. These are
Yeah, they've answered a lot of questions, and they've answered them really badly, and I would argue in some cases they discount things we know exist, which is the phenomenon of charge and different things, and just play games. They don't deal with the real arguments that have been around for hundreds of years on some of these subjects like drag, and they have an obligation to at least say more than they've said. All right, but I mean, these are silly questions. Does the ether fill space? Well, the dehilsters don't believe in ether, but they will tell you that yes, there's a lot of forces in space, a lot of force bits, lots and lots of them. What encapsulates each particle? Who cares? It's space, empty space. The 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 cell doesn't need to worry about what's on the outside. It has goop on the inside and a membrane. What's on the outside doesn't have anything to do with the cell existing. If space contours each particle, now of course it doesn't contour it. The particle contours the space in the sense that the particle imposes itself and exists and occupies a location, and that's all it has to do. What's outside? Who cares? What is space? Again, define or draw space. Why don't you do the same thing, you fucking cunt? I mean, what an asshole. I mean, again, he draws his own theory with ropes, with space between the ropes. I mean, what the fuck? What is your real theory, Bill? I mean, do you really say all the ropes are touching each other and so there is no empty space because it's all ropes? Don't think that would work, because then all the ropes would have to be parallel, and that's not going to work. What the fuck are you talking about? Fuck. Is space, ether, infinite, or finite? Well, I mean, these are questions. I don't know why anybody even bothers with these questions. You're not going to be able to answer them with the evidence we have in any kind of real rational way. You can just do out of your ass speculations. So I don't know, and I don't see how it's really important to the physics. But I think the concept of infinite, like Bill, I agree. You can't play with it. It never works. It always creates a paradox.
Going to be his essentially that's going to be his mechanism. An object on the surface of the Earth is constantly being pushed up by fewer G1s, and pushed down by more G1s, giving a net pushing force downward toward the gravitational center of the Earth. Okay? And the loss of G1s through the Earth causes a reduction of the G1s towards the Moon. Hence, there are more G1s pushing the Moon towards the Earth than there are G1s pushing the Moon away from the Earth. Okay? I think you get the idea here. It's going to be a push.
Yes, that's the Lesage theory, with their idiotic statement that somehow electrons and photons are the same thing, which they're not.
Gravity theory, made with particles, okay? That's what the Hilsters are proposing. And I've got one here, but I think I'm going to skip it for brevity.
Yeah, I don't think I saw this part, so I forgot to watch the rest of it.
And so here, let's see if I can put this one up here. They explain how the Moon, we'll go directly to the example, how the Moon is attracted. Now the pictures on the bottom.
So again, he can't really argue with this mechanics not doing gravity, because it does it, and it's called mock gravity. So I mean, the idea's been around 300 years. It's been dismissed by people like Feynman for, I think, superficial reasons, because they couldn't account for why this force would not create a drag problem, in the sense that nothing could acquire velocity and maintain a velocity. It would always have its velocity destroyed. And as I've pointed out, we do observe that with electrons and protons. So elemental particles, that drag is real, but composite particles, more complex things like helium nuclei, manage to do it. So there's a reason they manage to do it, and what a physicist should do is maybe attempt to reason out how it possibly could do it by having its own little motor.
Modify them just to give you the idea of how his theory works. Essentially, there are more forces pushing on the Earth towards the Moon than there are forces pushing the Earth away from the Moon. And likewise, you have so many.
Momentum is absorbed, meaning it doesn't get to the Moon. Momentum is absorbed, meaning it doesn't get to the Earth. Yes, it's not that complicated. But again, the real answer is every piece of matter on the Earth is still accelerating towards its center, and those are the pieces that are absorbing energy. And by absorbing energy, the energy doesn't get to someplace else, and that creates a pressure differential.
particles pushing on the moon from the outside than you have pushing on the moon from the Earth vantage point. Okay, and that's how they're pushed from the outside inwards. That's how they're going to explain their famous gravity.
Yes, really mock gravity. Go look it up.
Okay, so this is going to be the mechanism for the moon, and so let's see if we can illustrate what the Hillsters have in mind. Okay, let's see here.
Let's see how bad a straw man this is.
So I've illustrated what I think they have in mind, and here they have.
So I don't know why it has them doing all this vibrating. And you really haven't illustrated in the sense that you have the same number of particles inside as you do outside. The particles have to move in straight lines. That's part of the theory. So it only works with a straight line force. Particles can move in crooked lines. It won't happen.
All these particles emanating from the moon going to the Earth, particles from the Earth going to the moon, but there's more particle behind them than there are in front of them. Okay, so this is a dynamic version, essentially, of what they're proposing.
It's nice that you made this graphic. I wish I had the same skills in terms of being able to do that in Paint and get it to work. So it's nice you went to the trouble, but it really isn't a very good illustration because it's a shadow, and shadows are a little more obvious than what you've drawn here.
Right? Okay, so we have a lot of noise there, too much noise, and so we need to clear that up and find out if we can, clean it up a little bit. And so what I'm proposing is let's do it this way. Let's get rid of all the matter in the universe, and we only have two objects in the entire.
Right. So what did he just do? He took out all the external pressure and stuck it in between and said, look, you can't make attraction with particles in between these two things. Well, obviously it's not their theory, Bill.
Our universe. We have empty space, completely empty space, nothing out there. And we go with what the Hillsters are proposing. We have a net flow of particles, from the moon to the Earth and from the Earth to the moon, but there's no outside particles pushing the moon towards the Earth or no outside particles pushing the Earth towards the moon. All we have is the...
Yes, the inside ones aren't being self-generated, Bill. So again, where did they come from? They have to come from the outside. They're not just here magically. The whole point is it's like a light being on, light being off. You have to turn on the light before there can be light reflecting between me and another object. The light has to turn on, has to reflect off the screen, reflect off me, reflect back. You can't do this to somebody's argument. I mean, this is just a despicable straw man. The Hillster's wrong, but he's wrong for completely different reasons.
Repulsive particles sent by the moon to the Earth and vice versa. Okay, so all we have is repulsion. And again, because they're saying that more particles arrive on the Earth and leave, and vice versa.
This is just so trivial. Again, this is just, he deserves to be mocked and ridiculed by conventional physics if this is how he's going to treat people. He's going to just distort and pervert what they said, turn it into a completely different theory, and then argue how it's stupid. Well, guess what, Bill? That's bullshit. I mean, that's just fucking bullshit. I call bullshit. I call shenanigans. Fuck you. This is a shitty argument. You really should apologize. And like I said, I have no use for the D. Hillster bullshit. But this is bullshit. This is worse bullshit. Lying, essentially. You're just lying, okay? This isn't what they said. This isn't what they've argued. You're putting words in their mouth, and that's just wrong. Fuck you. Yeah, you're bad. You're bad, Bill. Bad. I mean, there's no point in talking about the integrity of language and how words have to mean something. We need objects, and we need this. When you're doing this kind of duplicitous bullshit, when you can't even, take a simple theory, it's pretty simple, shadows, and you can't even draw it right. You can't draw a shadow correctly. You don't know how to illustrate a shadow. I mean, I could take the board out and illustrate for you a shadow. You can't do a shadow? I mean, come on. Fuck you. All right, that's we don't need to hear anymore, right? I mean, that's just so egregious, so bad. 10 points off, whatever, red flag, yellow flag, whatever. Fuck you, a penalty box, something. You can't do that, shithead. Foul. You know what foul means? You run foul from reasonable process. You're not doing rational physics, you're doing liar physics, shyster physics, bullshitter physics, cheater physics. Fuck you. Bad. Okay, enough of a video. So, till the next time, I'll have to watch the rest of this and just see how much worse it gets. But that's it. That's enough, right? You don't need to see any more than that. I mean, he took an external pressure and turned it into an internal pressure and then asked, well, why isn't there any external pressure? I mean, why is there? How are you going to make a attraction when all you have is stuff in between the two the Earth and the Moon? You don't have anything on the outside. I mean, it's just such a bullshit move. All right, so till next time, and such, and so forth and whatnot.